video, I'm going to perform an inspectional reading on this book, which I found at the library. I was just wandering the shelves, and for no particular reason, the title caught my eye. Anyhow, I have read the title, but I have not read anything else. So I am going to give myself 15 minutes to learn as much as I can from this book and about this book. And at the end of 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about what I did and try to answer these questions that are displayed on the screen right now. I'm going to start the timer right now. Okay, I am back again now, and I wanted to just talk first about what I did, and then I'll try to answer those questions. So the first thing I did was I looked at the inside flap and started reading the blurb there. Sometimes this isn't that helpful, but in this case, I did get to learn that the author has studied corruption in other contexts, so other countries, and written books about it. So that was helpful to know, and that what she's trying to do here is to kind of take the lessons she's learned from other contexts and other corrupt states and apply it to the US. I didn't finish reading the inside flap before I started to look briefly at the table of contents just to get a sense of the structure. Then I started reading the preface. Sometimes authors will call this preface, sometimes they will call it an introduction. The distinction between the two is not that important. In this case, the author brings up an example through a story, an example that illustrates the problem of corruption in the US and how it's been normalized in modern times. Sometimes introductions will introduce more of a framework or introduce some kind of conflict, like two ideas or two principles that can't both be true or can't both work together well, and before they get to some kind of resolution, so they're introducing the problem that they're going to tackle. Sometimes it's an explanation of a big idea. If you can do one thing, I highly recommend just reading the introduction closely, because the introduction is usually like a mini part of the book. It's like the book in miniature. So you'll get the broad strokes, you won't get so many of the details, but you should have a general sense of where the author is coming from reading the introduction. Then I went back to the table of contents to get a more specific understanding of the structure of the book, or the kind of the main themes that she thinks are important. And here I was planning on jumping around a little bit between the sections, because you can kind of think of each section as a mini book. So you can read the first few pages of the section, which serve as the introduction to that section. And you should, in most cases, get a sense of what that section is about. Again, the first few pages should be the rest of the section, but kind of in miniature. For instance, I didn't really know what the section on the Hydra is about. She uses these more evocative titles for her sections, and so I wanted to read a little bit about that. And I did the same thing for the section on It Throve on Wounds, which is about some of the efforts to combat corruption in the US, especially I think during the Gilded Age. I didn't look at the last section or the epilogue, but that's probably okay. The last stuff that comes in a book is probably even more dependent on the early stuff that comes. And so if you have to make a choice, I would prefer to spend more time on the early part of a book. I also looked through the references a bit, because in a book like this that's citing a lot of historical examples and modern examples and current events, you want to know that the author is actually working from reliable sources and is citing these sources properly, so that if you want to look up something they said, you can. You probably won't, but in the case that you can learn more, or look up more, or verify what the author said, it's good to do that. And as far as I can tell, she does a decent job. There's a lot of history books and newspaper articles, some radio shows that she's talking about. And the important thing that I think she does is that she pin cites here to the books where she's pulling quotes from or pulling examples from. She writes the specific page where relevant for that specific idea or paraphrase or quote or whatever. This is something that authors sometimes get a little sloppy with, and they will just cite a whole paper for a sentence that appears just on one page, or they'll cite a book for something that appears just on a couple of pages. Okay, now I'm going to try to answer those questions that I displayed on the screen for you. What kind of book is it? I would characterize this as a current events book, or maybe a journalistic account of history and current events. It's primarily about the dynamics of corruption and the history of it in the US. And at the end of the book, there is a little section about what we should do about this, but this plays a relatively minor role. Now, if you had just read the flap and not actually looked at the table of contents, you might think that half of the book is about what we could do about it. But actually, when you look at the table of contents and you see how it's structured, you see, well, the epilogue, which is where she talks about what we should do about it, is a small section. She uses a fair amount of references to ancient stories and contemporary ones to illustrate ideas. So yeah, okay. Summarize the unity of the book. Okay. Here is my kind of janky summary. It's just what I wrote quickly after reading. Corruption in politics, which begins with issues involving money changing hands and ends with Hydra-like coalitions of interested groups evading responsibility and enriching themselves, became normalized during the Gilded Age and has become normalized again, and we need to do something about it. Now, I think that's a fair summary from what I've read, but it would be an interesting exercise to make this summary after doing this inspectional reading of the book, then read, say, halfway through the book, do another summary, and then read the whole book and do a third summary and kind of compare those summaries to each other to track your increasingly nuanced understanding of what the author is saying, hopefully, ideally, if it's a good book. What's the structure of the book? I'm going to talk about both the larger structure and the mini structures. So the sections are roughly organized by theme, not by sequence in time. So there's the general influence of money that she talks about, and the specific case of money and wealth during the Gilded Age. And then she has this section on the growth of these organized factions or coalitions that are kind of maintaining and growing corruption. Then she talks about the attempts to stop corruption, and then I didn't get to the last section to really understand what she meant by that, or the epilogue. Within the chapter, she seems to be using a kind of journalistic formula where she introduces the topic by telling a story or giving an anecdote, and then she builds on that anecdote by providing more data or more statistics, or sometimes more stories, and kind of piling stories on stories to lead up to her main point, closer to the end of the chapter or maybe in the middle. That's just something that might be helpful in understanding the chapters themselves. What problem or problems does the author tackle? I have three here. The first is how corruption starts and grows. The second is the consequences of a corrupt society. And then she has a third point, which is what we should do to fight corruption. Is this a book worth reading? Yeah, this is obviously going to depend on what your learning goals are and what you're interested in. If you thought this was a book about a different subject matter, maybe you wouldn't be interested in it. For me, I'm going to answer this question with a yes. It seems to be well written and well researched. It seems like she does a decent job, not just of talking about the current moment, but about many of the enabling forces that have led to our current moment and other moments of crises in the past. There also isn't a huge time investment. It's not a dense academic book. It's fairly easy reading, even if it does involve a lot of historical examples and some statistics and stuff like that. Okay, so that was my demonstration of inspectional reading. It's not something that I write down explicitly that much, so I don't have a lot of practice with it, but I think it's a good exercise to try this sometimes and just give it a shot. I still have more videos to do in this series on reading, so if you're into it, subscribe, hit the bell notification, do all that kind of stuff, and I'll see you. Hey, it's me again. Real quick, if you are actually going to try this exercise, I would recommend against using a timer, because when you're using a timer, you start stressing about how much time you have left and what you still need to do in the book to understand what it's about, and there's just no need to feel that way. You want all of your energies focused on the book. So just set aside some flexible time, 20 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever, and then you can fully focus on the book. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.